Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight for our next My Water, My Future town hall, this time on a critical issue of public trust doctrine. And it's really an often overlooked part of our rights as citizens in a democratic society. Public trust plays a role in many of the biggest water issues we face in Michigan, from Nestle and other water bottlers commoditizing a public resource, to the Line 5 pipeline, and even the injustice of water shutoffs for non-payment in several of our large cities. Simply put, the public trust doctrine as it relates to water means that the residents of the state collectively own the water resources of that state, and the state government, or the trustee, is entrusted to protect the water resources for the current and future use and benefit of residents. On our panel tonight, we have three guests who are some of the strongest defenders of our public water resources in Michigan. Representative Rachel Hood from the 76th State House District in Grand Rapids, Skip Pruss, the former director of the Michigan Department of Energy, Labor, and Economic Growth, and former board chair at Flow for Love of Water, and an author and former Clean Water Action staffer who's now a senior advisor at Flow, Dave Dempsey. And they're each going to take a minute to introduce themselves and talk about why public trust protections for our water is important to them in just a minute. Before we get started with that, just want some ground rules for our participants. There will be an opportunity for a few audience questions. So if you have any questions during the event tonight, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you're watching on Zoom, and you can put your questions in there. And if you're watching on Facebook, feel free to type your questions into the Facebook chat, and we have people monitoring that as well. So without any further ado here, let's start with Representative Hood. To introduce yourself for a moment, talk about why public trust is important to you.
Thanks, Sean. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to everyone who's joined tonight. It's good to see you and be together despite being apart. My journey with the public trust began when I started a job at the West Michigan Environmental Action Council in 2007. It was right as the Great Lakes Compact was being finalized, and also around the time when a really important court case, Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation versus Nestle, was underway and headed to the Michigan Supreme Court. So I received baptism by fire, about 20 years, I think, of work that Dave Dempsey and many others had done to establish the Great Lakes Compact and the agreement between the 8 Great Lakes states and Canada. And Michigan was at the precipice of protecting its groundwater resources, and ultimately by 2008 missed that chance. So an important part of the history of our laws in Michigan around the environmental movement was the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, which was stood up in a partnership between Joe Sachs and the University of Michigan, and the West Michigan Environmental Action Council, and the Milliken administration played an important role as well. And really the foundation of the Michigan Environmental Protection Act was that all citizens of the state of Michigan have the right to file to sue to protect the state's natural resources, regardless of property ownership or economic damage. And during the Nestle MCWC case, that foundation was eroded. And so since that time, it has been a passion of mine to make sure that we not only finish the work of protecting our groundwater and the public trust, but also make sure that we restore that foundational block of law under MIPA, and ensure that citizens can continue to protect our vast and amazing natural resources. And of course, we all over that time have learned how much more important those resources are in the face of climate change. So those threats continue to keep me focused on these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us tonight, Representative Hood. And now moving on with Skip Pruss. And Skip, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background with public trust? I think you're muted.
There we go. Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me. So my first substantive experience with the public trust doctrine was when I was a younger attorney in the Attorney General's office. In the late 80s, in collaboration with the National Wildlife Federation, the Attorney General's office filed suit against Consumers Power and DTE for the fish kills associated with the operation of the Ludington Pump Storage Plant. And long story short, that was many years of litigation, went up to the Supreme Court, bounced around the courts, ultimately was settled. But the Court of Appeals did affirm in a decision that the fish belonged to the people of the state of Michigan. And if they were damaged by private parties, the state and the public was entitled to compensation. And so that was my first active use of the public trust doctrine as a lawyer. You mentioned that I was the former board chair of FLOW. What attracted me so much to FLOW was the staff, of course, and Jim Olson, who's a international expert on the public trust doctrine. But the allure of the potential to expand the public trust doctrine from its existing place in our jurisprudence and to apply it to other problems that would be so appropriate to address through the doctrine. And specifically, one of the wonderful things about the public trust doctrine is that it looks forward. It looks at evolving science, and uniquely in our jurisprudence, at least to the best of my understanding, it allows government to revoke past authorizations, past permitted activities based upon new information, new data, and new scientific understanding. And so the implications of that are profound. The public trust doctrine in its strictest form in Michigan applies only to navigable waters, but science tells us that groundwater is interconnected with surface water in virtually all places. In fact, science tells us that the hydrosphere is one system. And so there is potential for the public trust doctrine to address problems like climate change and other things, overflowing septic tanks. There are legal scholars who have written that we should use the public trust doctrine to accelerate renewable energy around the country, because the acid gases and heavy metals and particulates and thermal loadings from power plants affect our waters. And you could use the public trust doctrine to argue that this impairment is actionable, both under the doctrine and MEPA.
Great, thanks very much, Skip, and thanks for joining us tonight. And last but certainly not least, Dave Dempsey, our senior advisor for FLOW and former author. You want to introduce yourself, Dave, and talk a little about your history with public trust?
Sure, Sean. I want to thank Clean Water Action for inviting me, and it's good to be back with my alma mater, which I worked for back in the 90s. I'm also really pleased to be with two distinguished panelists, Representative Hood, who's one of a long line of great legislators from the Grand Rapids area when it comes to the environment, and a good person too, I might add. And maybe not as good a person, but Skip Pruss, who's an old friend of mine who's done a lot of good work. And I'm glad he mentioned the consumers energy pump storage case, because that's a landmark, not just environmental trust law and public trust law, but also in recapturing resources for the public. As a result of that litigation, there's been, I don't know how many hundreds of millions, or at least scores of millions of dollars in money put aside for fisheries projects to benefit the public. My current service at FLOW has a lot to do with the public trust doctrine. When I left the International Joint Commission back in 2016, and looked around for where I wanted to work next, flow was the natural place because public trust doctrine is very dear to me. I think it's a very important and overlooked principle of common law that has the potential to be the long-term insurance policy for our water resources. Unfortunately, the state legislation in the Great Lakes Compact, which has been much touted as the solution to our water diversion woes, do not fully implement and use the public trust doctrine to protect those waters. And I guess we can talk more about that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. And so we're going to get into some questions here. And again, for those of you joining us on Zoom, if you have any questions, feel free to type those into the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And for those on Facebook, if you type your questions into the comment box, we have somebody monitoring there as well. So our first question tonight is for Skip, and anybody else who'd like to hop in as well. But Skip, was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how public trust protections for water have been interpreted legally through the years, and how the public trust doctrine might be applied to address some of our current environmental concerns, like the privatization and commercialization of water, water shutoffs in our cities, and even where it applies on something like Line 5 pipeline.
Sure, I'll have a go at that. So the landmark case, which I'm guessing that many people who are tuned into this webinar are familiar with, is Illinois Central Railroad versus Illinois, a case from 1892 decided by the United States Supreme Court, where Illinois conveyed actually thousands of square miles of Lake Michigan to the private railroad company. The Illinois Attorney General at the time filed suit, argued that the public trust doctrine did not allow the state to alienate that land, bottomlands of Lake Michigan. And of course, the outcome was that despite the fact, and this is interesting, it has an interesting implication to Line 5 in the current litigation. Illinois Central Railroad in that case, to the best of my understanding, had already started construction. They were building stuff already. And that was all undone by this decision, because the public trust doctrine, unique in our jurisprudence, and an ancient legal doctrine going back all the way to the Institutes of Justinian, through the Magna Carta, to the US colonies, to the Northwest Territory Act, to inform our jurisprudence, is sort of a special law, like super common law that states can't, simply by fiat terminate. And so Illinois, in its sovereign capacity, couldn't convey Lake Michigan bottomlands. And so that, is a huge, important principle informing public trust jurisprudence throughout the country now. It was reaffirmed in Glass-Steagall in 2005, which to some people, some observers, it was an unexpected result. That was a case brought by private Lake Michigan landowners to prevent the public from being able to traverse the shorelines of Lake Michigan. And in that case, our Michigan Supreme Court decided that that the public's rights were paramount, and indeed the public had a right to traverse the 3,200 miles plus of Lake Michigan shoreline below the ordinary high water mark. So in terms of contemporary uses of the act, the core of the doctrine is that government has, what our courts have said, a quote, high, solemn, and perpetual duty to protect the common interest, our ownership, your interest, your ownership, and my ownership in the waters of the state. And that is really, in essence, an anti-commodification provision or doctrine as well, because you own it and I own it, and government as fiduciary under our law cannot alienate it. So it belongs to us in perpetuity. And we have, that being said, we have almost a reciprocal responsibility as citizens to be vigilant in protecting the public trust doctrine and its application.
Yeah, thanks very much, Skip. And just to follow up on that, so one of the things I know that people have at least theorized a possible application of public trust might be in the context of residential water shutoffs, where the argument essentially being that because a person's ability to put a well in their backyard is sort of taken away when the city water is what's providing them with water. The fact that their water can then be shut off could be a potential violation of the public trust doctrine because it violates their ability to use the water which they're a co-owner of. And I know that hasn't really been tested, but is that like a possible future application when you talk about how the public trust doctrine has sort of evolved over the years?
So that issue is, well, it's a critically important question that implicates other questions as well.
Sorry about that.
David, I'm glad it's your dog first. So if a corollary to the public trust doctrine is that there's a human right to water, a public right to water, then maybe that suggests that, and because it's, the public trust doctrine is really an aspect of property law, that if someone is living somewhere, and has a right of occupation to land, that there's a corollary right to water associated with it. Now, as you said, it hasn't been tested, but it's possible to make the argument, and the argument I think is plausible. If you go back to Justinian, this is what the Institutes of Justinian said: by the law of nature, these things are common to mankind: the air, running water, the sea, and consequently the shores of the sea. So, as I tried to say initially, one of the attractions of the public trust doctrine is that it should be expanded to encompass the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, because it is all one system. And so, the doctrine is enjoying a resurgence. It is being asserted in climate litigation around the country. And the gist of it is that the continued combustion of fossil fuels is resulting in impairment of water and air, and these are public trust resources, and government has the fiduciary responsibility as trustee to protect the public from this impairment.
Excellent, thank you very much. And so next we have a question for Dave. And in your book, Great Lakes for Sale, and for those of you who are watching and maybe haven't read this book, if you have, great. If you haven't read Great Lakes for Sale, it's a very short book, really, really well done, with a very solid recounting of the history of the Great Lakes Compact and that whole struggle against commoditizing water. And so, Dave, in Great Lakes for Sale, you covered the story in detail, like I said, about the compact and how we essentially allowed water bottlers to violate public trust principles by commodifying a public resource. Can you talk a little more about what went wrong, in your view, with the Great Lakes Compact, and any reforms that we might consider to strengthen protections for our public trust water resources?
Sure. I want to start with where most environmental protection begins, and that's with citizens. Back in 2001, I believe, when Nestle came to Michigan, after being kicked out of Wisconsin, I should point out, to bottle water, the local citizens group, Michigan Citizens for Water Conservation, filed suit. And Jim Olson, my colleague now at Flow, was the lead attorney. And after, it was called a David versus Goliath battle, but David actually fought Goliath to a draw, and the courts found a public trust interest in protecting the common waters of the state from extraction and limited the amount of water that Nestle could withdraw, which was a pretty big win, actually. Then the, kind of stitch this all together in the history. Then the Great Lakes Compact was being drafted at that time, and with Nestle basically bottling water and taking it out of Michigan, an opinion was requested from the Attorney General, who was then Jennifer Granholm, as to whether this export of water was legal or illegal under Great Lakes Protection Acts and both state and federal law. And she ruled that, in an opinion, that it was a diversion that had to be approved by the Great Lakes states. Shortly thereafter, Nestle and its lobbyists began to promote legislation that would essentially authorize this withdrawal and export of bottled water. A major battle amongst the interest in Lansing, with the grassroots organizations, environmental organizations, actually being at odds with the mainstream organizations. Glad to say clean water was on the side of the grassroots. And the ultimate result was that legislation passed, which does require withdrawal permits for taking water out of our environment, but it also, in essence, exempted the export of bottled water from the protections of restrictions on Great Lakes diversion. In essence, it basically said that bottling water and taking it out of Michigan is not a diversion. So we basically sanctioned Nestle's export of Great Lakes water. We need to close that with a couple pieces of legislation. We definitely need to pass state legislation to treat exports of bottled water for sale as a diversion so it can be regulated. We also need at some point to go back to the compact, which is going to take a long time to close some of the loopholes there too.
Great, thank you, Dave. And so speaking about closing things like the water bottling loophole here, we have a question for Representative Hood. Before being elected, you served as the executive director for West Michigan Environmental Action Council, as you said. And from your experience of advocacy at WMEAC, which is the acronym we use for it, for those of you who may not have heard that, why do you think public trust is such an important but not really well grasped part of our bundle of rights as citizens in a democratic society? And then it would also be good if you could talk a little bit about the water protection package that you and Representatives Robbie and Pahutsky introduced earlier this year, and especially your bill in the package relating to the water bottling loophole.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Well, I think the public trust is actually something that individuals have had really enormous resonance with. You know, when we saw 80,000 people come out to fight the permitting of Nestle, the expansion of their permits over the course of, I think it was 2017, 2016, it was, you know, really a profound show of the way Michiganders feel about their water, how passionate they are about their water, and their passion for the public trust. Even though people acted on that specific issue, though, I don't think they could necessarily name that it was fundamentally a public trust issue. And, you know, Skip's description of the law that supports the public trust and the, you know, not just generations, but, you know, decades and centuries of law that built public trust and defined public trust in international law and in US law and state law, it's really overwhelming. There's a lot of information and a lot of history, and I think it just goes kind of beyond our everyday knowledge of how the law works and our concepts of, you know, what legislators do and what the courts do and so on. I mean, this is, it is truly an ancient law, and it is profound. So then the bill package that we put together has been bouncing around the legislature for a long time. 3 bills. So Rep. Robbie has a bill that places groundwater and defines groundwater in the public trust for the state of Michigan. I have my bill, which is House Bill 5291, and this bill closes the 5.7 gallon loophole that Dave Dempsey just described. And this loophole allows Nestle and other folks to distribute products outside of the Great Lakes that are made with Great Lakes water. And it also begins to tackle the ideas around how water is taken when it is taken outside of a municipal system. So I've been challenged on this question quite a bit. Here I am in Beer City, right? Grand Rapids. And I am the owner of a brewery. We don't yet ship beer outside of the Great Lakes. And honestly, I hope that we never grow quite that big, because then it'll be time for me to sell. It won't be in alignment with my values. But Founders down the street does sell beer outside of the Great Lakes watershed. But they pay for the water that they use to brew their beer. They pay through a municipal system, the city of Grand Rapids. In contrast to Nestle, who is pulling groundwater out of water wells that are owned by that they own themselves. They own the land themselves. So it's an important distinction and does not allow for water to be withdrawn outside of a municipal system. So it closes 2 loopholes actually. And then Pahutsky's bill is the final piece in this package, and it directs the DNR to have jurisdiction over those water resources like the well that Nestle is pulling from that are not connected to a municipal system.
Sean,
yeah.
may I make a comment?
Yes, please do.
Just wanted to underscore the first point that Representative Hood made. I think that it's time for the public trust doctrine to not only expand, but to be embraced and to be used constructively and actively. We have this remarkable public consensus around water. It is bipartisan. We have this survey work that's been done now for several years by the Environmental Law and Policy Center in Great Lakes states that show that Republicans overwhelmingly want to protect water quality and water quantity. The consensus is absolutely bipartisan. Every year there's a survey, and the American public feel that it's more important for government to spend money on water infrastructure than on roads. So we do have this remarkable consensus. And if people understood the public trust doctrine and its implications for them personally, and the fact that it's public ownership of a public resource, I think we could go farther. And we should, because, one of the things I know, I try to do, and a lot of other people try to do, is not take the Great Lakes for granted. This is this remarkable, globally unique resource. 20%, we know the stats, right? 20% of the world's supply of fresh surface water, 84% of North America's, 95% of the United States fresh surface water is in the Great Lakes. And with that proximity comes, I think, special responsibilities. And I think that concept would resonate with the Michigan public as well. And so last point here, there's sort of like a double entendre in the public trust. One of the things that we've really lost is trust in government. We see that statistically and by surveys. It's just plummeted. And having a further conversation and a narrative about the importance of the public trust doctrine, I think, could help at least a bit in restoring trust in government.
Very well put. Thank you very much for that comment, Skip. And yeah, it's amazing to think that we're in a state defined by water. The very shape of the state is defined by water. And You know, there's, as you mentioned, a very broad consensus among the public about protecting that water. And we need people from all across the state reaching out to their state house representatives and state senators and asking them to support the public trust legislation that Representative Hood and her colleagues have put forward. And those of you who are watching this on Zoom, you'll see in the chat box, our comms person, Jen, has put in a link to somewhere where on the Clean Water Action website where you can go right now to write a letter or an email to your representative and state senator asking them to support this critical legislation for our public trust resources. So please do that. The more people we get involved on issues like this, that's how we're able to win. And we do have a...
if I can just jump in for a moment,
Yeah,
Sean,
please, yes.
before we close out this section of the discussion. The House bills that we've been talking about have been referred to the House Policy Committee on Natural Resources. Chairman Howell is chairing that committee, and he's a wonderful person. And to Skip's point, if this is in fact a priority across both sides of the aisle, then our Republican leaders of our committees and of the legislature should be moving these issues forward and not allowing them to continue to languish in committee. So especially for those of you who are on this call and who are represented by Republicans, those calls are particularly important because those are the ones that will help to motivate their Republican colleague to move forward on this issue.
Sean, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Very important concept that Jim Olson of FLOW has developed. It's called the Public Water Public Justice Act. And the two features that I think are the most important to talk about here are, number one, it would end the practice of allowing Nestle to take the public's water for free. It would create a royalty system where those who take water and bottle it and sell it would have to pay a royalty to the state if they were authorized to do that. And secondly, the funds would go into a water fund, including money to set up affordability programs so that nobody in Detroit, Flint, or elsewhere is shut off from their water service. So in essence, we'd get a public benefit to citizens of the state from what is essentially a giveaway to Nestle right now.
Absolutely. Thank you for raising that Public Water Public Justice Act. It's, at Clean Water, we are very fond of that piece of legislation as well. We hope to see that move coming up here in the future. We do have a question on this topic in our Q&A box here from Jennifer McKay. And she's asking, why is the DNR better suited to manage water withdrawals than EGLE? For those who don't know those acronyms, Department of Natural Resources. Why are they better suited to manage withdrawals than the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy?
Well, I'll just say this, as a former deputy director of the Department of Environmental Quality, the predecessor to EGLE, it never made any sense to me that the DNR and the DEQ would be separated. What we have in these two agencies are highly educated environmental professionals who are really committed to the resource, to the state, and to environmental protection. And having them together enhances conversation, discussion, collaboration, sharing of information, and from my point of view, it's always been a mistake to separate these agencies.
So I'll take that question on just for a second. I'm not exactly sure why the DNR is named in the legislation as being responsible for water withdrawals, but I think there's a perception these days that DNR is more of a resource protection agency, whereas EGLE, by virtue of almost 20 years or maybe more than 20 years of legislative rollbacks, is sort of the permit processor. call them permits are us sometimes, because it seems to be the ethic. It's certainly improved under Governor Whitmer. We're seeing much more protection afforded to permits, but the statutes kind of limit the agency to processing and issuing permits. There's very little enforcement capability anymore.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think we covered that one. So another question that was just asked here from John Freeman is if there is any linkage between the public trust doctrine and eminent domain.
Let the lawyer answer that one.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, this is a lawyer who hasn't practiced law in 20 years. So one would think that the public trust doctrine certainly prevents any private party that is authorized, even if it's authorized to exercise eminent domain over public trust resources. So utilities, pipeline companies typically have the power of eminent domain, and I would think that our jurisprudence would not allow them to exercise that power with respect to public trust resources. With respect to government using the power of eminent domain, well, the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act and the public trust doctrine allow the conveyance of an interest in public trust resources if and only if one of two findings are made, and that would be no impairment of the public trust or actual enhancement of the public trust for the benefit of the people. Absent either one of those two factors, you can't convey any interest. And importantly, you can never convey a complete interest in a public trust resource, in part for the reason that I stated earlier, is that new science, new information, new public understanding may require government to change its mind with respect to the use of public trust resources. The illustrative case of this was a litigation in California where the city of Los Angeles was diverting water from Mona Lake. That was authorized, it was permitted, but then they understood that it was having an ecological impact on Mona Lake, this continuous withdrawal. And the courts ruled that you could undo that because the public trust doctrine takes into account new knowledge, new scientific understanding.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's always good to have a lawyer on the panel for questions like that about how eminent domain and public trust might interact. And so we have another question here in the chat. This is great. We're getting a lot of engagement on this critical issue. From Iris Potter, is asking, and she's asking for Skipper Dave, do you think we have any or a good chance to be successful with Line 5 shutdown using the public trust doctrine argument in court?
Well, my non-lawyer's perspective is we do have a pretty good chance. That case has been argued recently by the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, on behalf of the people of Michigan. She's seeking to, in essence, evict Enbridge from their easement across the Straits of Mackinac because of their poor track record and the risks that they're posing. But Skip will have to kind of give me the legal analysis on that.
I'm actually limited because I'm a Special Assistant Attorney General, and part of my portfolio includes aspects of this litigation. But let me say this, the public trust doctrine is an essential part of the state's legal position. I also have to credit the National Wildlife Federation and the work that they have done on public trust jurisprudence and Line 5 and the history of Line 5, and their work has certainly informed the work of the Attorney General's office in preparing that case.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very critical case and a strong use of the public trust doctrine as well. And so, yeah, we have another question for all of our panelists. In your opinion, what are some of the biggest current and future threats to our water that could be addressed by increased awareness and strength of public trust protections? Don't all jump at once.
Well, I think the PFAS issues that we've seen in our state, when we link them to public trust, we have new arguments to hold polluters accountable to dealing with that particular legacy contaminant, which is so clearly harmful to public health. So that might be, I haven't heard discussions yet, and maybe I've missed them, about the PFAS issue as it relates to public trust, but I think those types of issues where we have clear lines to polluters and accountability, the public trust is a tool that is relevant. And then, you know, very excited to see the public trust being used in legal cases, you know, other pipeline cases, and other kind of broad climate issues around air quality, et cetera.
I think Skip has made a good point that in the future, I think the public trust doctrine could be invoked and has preliminarily been invoked in climate cases, because obviously what is changing in our atmosphere has a lot to do with the public uses of water. There was one case brought, I think it's been dismissed now, but was brought on behalf of children. I think it's called the Juliana case, where the plaintiffs were young people who were basically saying that government was neglecting its duty as a trustee by permitting climate change to interfere with their future and their uses of water in the future.
So I have to say that David is being modest. For the last couple of years, he's done some extremely important work on groundwater contamination and groundwater flow, you know, how much groundwater actually ultimately reaches the Great Lakes and tributary waters of the Great Lakes. And that work that David has done under Flow's auspices is accessible, and you know, I commend it. I would go as far to say this, with respect to the endemic groundwater contamination problems, and PFAS is a huge, huge problem, but it's a red flag, an indicator of a much broader problem of, you know, groundwater contamination all throughout the state that is really unchecked. And for the last 20 years, the state hasn't required, in many instances, in most instances, active cleanup of releases of hazardous substances that make its way to groundwater. I want to say this as it relates to the public trust doctrine. I think there's a strong argument that government, because it is trustee, and that being trustee means that it has a fiduciary duty to protect the resource, you can argue that the failure to protect groundwater and to address groundwater is a failure to administer the public trust doctrine as the law requires. I think that's, at least in the abstract, a sound argument.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all very much for those thoughts on you know, the increased use of public trust protections going on here in the future. And we did have another audience question that came in from Emily. My understanding was that the 5.7 gallon loophole is in the Great Lakes Compact. How would state legislation closing that loophole in Michigan impact withdrawals from other Great Lakes states and from the Great Lakes Basin as a whole?
I can begin to address that, and then Dave might be able to put some finer points on it. It's my understanding that the Great Lakes Compact, which is the agreement between the 8 Great Lakes states and Canada, was ratified, and then each state was sort of sent home to go and do some work around various groundwater protections and uses of groundwater resources state by state. And that was because each state has unique geology and different science to bring to bear to protections of groundwater. It's easy to conflate all of those laws, and a lot of the dynamics all happened around the same time as the Great Lakes Compact was being closed out. So I do think that the conversation often gets murky around that, but there is a particular public law, I could give you the Public Act number in a second here, that needs to be addressed to close that 5.7 gallon loophole. And that's what my bill 5219 achieves.
I would say the loophole makes absolutely no sense. You can ship a freighter full of bottles of water under that threshold out of the Great Lakes, and it's not considered a diversion. But if you just put the same volume of water in the freighter without bottles, it would be considered a diversion, or it could be regulated. So it makes no sense. The problem with the compact is that it allows states like Michigan, under the legislation we've been talking about, to regulate these shipments of bottled water as diversions, but each state has to take its own initiative. So Michigan should do that, but the other 7 states would still have to act to make it a uniform policy.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And I know, that's a question I feel like was addressed pretty well for those of you who may not have read it in Great Lakes for Sale, given lots of pitches to Dave's books here tonight. That with water withdrawals, it can essentially be death by 1,000 cuts for our water resources. And so if we have time for one more audience question, if anybody has a question they'd like to, oh, looks like we got another one popped in just now. And so, yeah, we have okay, so from Jennifer McKay, why are we talking about bottled water when ag and other water diversions use way more water from Michigan and the Great Lakes Basin?
Well, I'll jump in and point out that the agricultural community has been a big stakeholder in these controversies, and in my opinion, often fails to understand the collective nature of water and the shared nature of the resources. It's my opinion, and having studied these laws for many years now, that public trust actually protects the many diverse growers in the state of Michigan, especially those small farmers who I deeply respect and who we're all dependent on for our food resources. But it's been spun over time by other stakeholder groups who benefited from kind of confusing those issues and spun it in such a way as to create division between the agricultural community and the water protection community. And that's a shame. I hope that we can correct that. There was a time in the recent past when we were on the same page. And further, I do think that we need to do more research and understanding, bring emerging science and technologies to bear to better understand how we can really become, I anticipate we will be the fruit basket or the vegetable basket of the world within the next decades, and the time is now to begin to understand how we can innovate farming practices to protect and sustain our groundwater resources for generations to come. I see these practices underway often in the Chesapeake Bay, where a lot of innovation has been underway, and other places. Of course, communities across the globe who struggle with drought and who have seen increasing pressure around water resources. have shown us that we can farm differently. We can farm in ways that are much more conservative in the use of water, and protect that water as part of a sustainable and regenerative system.
I think the reason we're talking about bottled water tonight is because bottled water poses a unique threat legally, in that it's essentially private companies are taking the public's water and selling it as their product. Certainly there are many other industries that use water as an ingredient. That's a different legal issue entirely. And by allowing one industry to capture and sell a public resource as their own private property, I think we are risking losing control of the water that does belong to the public.
Yeah, thank you guys very much. It's I think a very solid answer, and it's you know, in 2016, it was so inspiring to see the thousands of Michiganders who showed up for the one Nestle public comment session. And maybe everybody couldn't put their finger on the public trust doctrine as the reason why commoditization of our water was wrong, but there was sure a lot of, 80,000 Michiganders gave public comment along those lines, including a bus full of people at that hearing from Flint who didn't have drinking water at all at the time. So the last question for folks this evening is, what can regular folks watching at home do to help protect and advocate for our public water resources?
Well, make sure to pay your dues to Clean Water Action and get involved in organizations like FLOW, who help to keep these issues, keep our public up to date and educated on these issues, and help to mobilize people around the solutions that are happening, be they in local communities or in our state legislature or federal legislature.
Yeah, there's no substitute for citizen action. That's where all the good things that we've got in Michigan began. It's the 50th anniversary of MEPA, the law that Rachel was talking about, the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, which was actually the product of the West Michigan Environmental Action Council, which she used to be director of. And it passed because of overwhelming public support. It ran up against a buzzsaw of industry opposition, but it still passed because the public was championing it.
Don't forget to contact your state legislatures about certain bills that are critically important. Sending emails, something as simple as a quick phone call to an office can give voice to these issues and make sure that it rises to the top of the list.
Yeah, thanks very much. And Skip, any additional thoughts from you on how folks can get involved?
Well, it's just so important for people to get involved, to engage. We had this golden era of environmental protection in Michigan. The nation's eyes were directed at Michigan in the late 60s and early 70s, where we enacted MEPA and so many other laws, and all the cognate laws to the federal statutes that we depend on today. And as David said, it was because people became engaged and demanded that government respond. And so some way, somehow, we have to find ways to support Michelle Hood, her colleagues, message her Republican colleagues in particular, and make clear that these are important issues that must be addressed.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Oh, great. We just got a message from somebody in our chat from Susan Whedon saying that she just contacted Representative O'Malley. So thanks for taking action.
All right. Thank you.
Way to go, Susan.
Yes. And the Take Action link was just posted above that, so folks can go in and contact their lawmakers now. It's a great time to do it. I really want to thank all of our panelists for joining tonight and for all their good work, Representative Hood and Skip Pruss, Dave Dempsey. Also wanted to thank our support team for these events, who just does a phenomenal job making sure we have the right action links and links to articles that are relevant put in our chat here, and also in getting these up online the next day. Jen Schlicht, our comms person, and Meredith Gillies, our Southeast Michigan program organizer. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us for the next My Water, My Future virtual town hall. Oh, and my cat, for those of you who haven't met her yet. Getting a little bit antsy right now. I'd like to invite all of you to join us 2 weeks from tonight on June 25th for our Climate Change is Water Change town hall. We'll be joined by Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and the founder and chair of the DNC Council on the Climate Crisis, Michelle Dietrich. So thank you everybody for joining tonight, and everybody have a great evening.
Sean, thank you. Clean Water Action does such great work, and you're a great leader.
Appreciate it.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thanks to Dave and Skip for all your hard work too.
Thanks, Rachel.
Oh, thank
Appreciate you
for your work.